Hi, I'm back again. Today we're talking about transformations in labor and housing. I'm giving this lecture both for my course in U.S. history from 1877 to present at Juilliard and for Professor Scott's course as well. So this is a double. For my students, we most recently read an excerpt from C. Wright Mill's White Collar, The American Middle Class, which was published in 1951. What he's writing about in 1951 is really the development of a flourishing area of the economy, something new. Service sector jobs had existed before, but the explosion of those jobs in terms of just office work and sales and a whole variety of things was a new way of doing and organizing work for a large number of people. This generation's middle class was distinctive from those preceding it, in that most of its members would not be entrepreneurs. They wouldn't be small business owners. Instead, they could expect to spend their entire work life course working for other people in larger and larger companies with less and less direct relationship to commodity production. So this change in the nature of work triggered changes in how people felt about work, who got to do the work, and how they spent the money obtained from the work. So if you're part of my class, I'd like you to go to the Canvas page and then go to the discussion section in order to answer 2 questions about Mills as a primary source, in order to make sure that you're very on point and thinking about what kind of people we're talking about when we talk about these white middle-class people moving out to American suburbs in the 1950s. So pause there if you're in my class. So the rest of our lecture today is really going to talk a lot about residential segregation and white flight and how that works. Previously, we had talked about how World War II increased the need for industrial working class labor in the urban north, and at the same time that young men of working age were subject to the draft. Part of how this got compensated for was the migration, which had already started, but a real quickening of that migration pattern of African Americans moving from the American South into these northern American areas where there was a lot of industry. In addition, you have a lot of middle-class white women who are joining this same industrial labor force in unprecedented numbers to fill the gap. A lot of these women, it wasn't unusual for white women to be in the workforce, and certainly not for working class white women to be part of the workforce. But what was unusual is working after you have children. That was the new one. And that's what people, when you have that idea of Rosie the Riveter in mind, or an icon kind of like that, people think of it as this had never happened before, which isn't true. Women had always worked in paid labor, but that it was unusual to have white middle-class women with children working in paid labor, and that was something different. So as people came back from the war, the wartime workers who had already relocated to the American North typically stayed where they were. And at the same time, you have soldiers that are returning to these exact same cities. So more people lived in northern urban centers than ever, with the same amount of housing available. And so there wasn't enough housing for the size of the residential population. So part of this can be seen in this admittedly not super sophisticated, but it'll get the job done, graph. In this graph, you can see how the rates of urbanization, which are not terribly well defined here, but how those rates of urbanization are increasing steadily. The pressures of segregated housing in this context were extreme. They got exacerbated. So Black workers and white workers and workers who were Latino or Asian, they had all accumulated wages during the war. And at the same time, rationing had assured that they made more money than they could spend. They might have wanted to spend that money on something else, but it might not have been available. And so all of these workers are looking forward to opportunities to purchase property. And rising populations that had more money meant that property ownership, however, wasn't terribly practical. There was a housing shortage, wherein more people wanted to buy than there were homes available. So how American families responded to this problem was really different based upon the family's race and class, but also upon religion and age. And I'm going to explain this problem by using 2 northern cities as case studies, Chicago and Detroit. What I'd like you to do now is pause the video and locate on this map Chicago, and Detroit. So in these American northern cities, there were many Black families that pushed against the boundaries of segregated neighborhoods, moving block by block. So as the neighborhood remained segregated and that boundary between Black and white neighborhoods remained important, right? At the same time, the boundaries of it were pushing outward, like a balloon expanding, I guess. For my students, I'd like you to pause now in order to get a sense of how artists were responding to this situation, of the pressure of not having enough housing and how that gets complicated by segregation. For that, I'd like you to go to the Pages section of Canvas and look at the links that are to Lorraine Hansberry, Langston Hughes, and Nina Simone. And all three of them have kind of a conversation with each other that's very deliberate in the context of talking about art and how art responds to this kind of crisis. Okay, so assuming you have now looked at those pages. So there was still segregation in cities such as Chicago, but again, it's that the boundaries of the neighborhoods where realtors would only sell to Black people or only sell to white people were shifting into what had historically been white-only blocks. So you can start to see this in Chicago, for example. These are census maps talking about racial distribution in 1950 on the left and 1960 on the right. So it's really interesting here. If you look at, for example, the indicator of West Side Black Belt, right? You can see that the area where African Americans are living isn't changing. It's not like they're moving elsewhere, but that the boundaries of where they're living are expanding, right? And that's what we're talking about, right? This expansion of a still segregated area. So how did white families respond to this expansion? This really depended upon age and class and military status. So for many white veterans who had young families, people who had initially rented or lived with their parents after returning to the war, the chance to purchase a single-family home in the suburbs was appealing. And it was appealing not only because there wasn't housing in the city, but because it promised a greater chance of avoiding Black neighbors or of having one's real estate investment reduced because one had Black neighbors. So you get this process where you have, oh, sorry, I forgot to show this slide. This is Chicago now. We'll talk more about that later. So part of what happens is that you have all of these people who have never been more demographically similar, all moving out to new places simultaneously. So this is called white flight. Okay. The post-war suburbs were more unigenerational, more white, less dependent on ethnic communities, and more affluent than their predecessors of suburbs of the late 19th and early 20th century. If you look down here, this idea of all the moving vans moving one after another all on the same day into housing developments where previously there had been nothing, or maybe orchards, and all into homes that are basically identical with only a little bit of variation. And they're all the same age, right? So it's not just that they're, all white, it's also that they're all under 30, This is a really interesting kind of moment of transition. Now, in order to understand how this is able to sustain itself, you really need to start with a good understanding of redlining. So I'd like you to pause this film for just a second and read this explanation of redlining. So young white families had the option to move in large part because of federal housing programs. White flight was subsidized by federal housing programs that lent money or backed private loans for purchasing property in quote-unquote safe neighborhoods. The assumption that white neighborhoods were safe investments and that Black neighborhoods were insecure investments had the collateral consequence that white purchasers were given a disproportionate share of public assistance for purchases. Black and other minority veterans' families could not move into these neighborhoods where it was possible to obtain a mortgage because their very existence would transform their lot from supposedly a good to a poor investment. Okay, in order to understand this problem more, I want to direct you to a web page. And that web page is, in my class, both under the Pages section of Canvas, and then there's questions in the discussion section of Canvas. So I'd like you to go through and study that and make sure you have a really good understanding of what is redlining, what is its relationship to white flight, and how does it contribute to segregation. Okay, if you've done that, you're back and you're ready to hear some more lecture. So redlining dovetailed with GI provisions that helped former soldiers buy homes with minimal down payments. By giving extraordinary assistance to veterans, but often in forms that only white GIs could really use, the GI Bill pulled massive numbers of white families into the middle class. So the GI Bill gave extraordinary opportunities to both white and minority veterans, but white veterans found it much easier to take advantage of these opportunities because there was more housing and education options available to them. So this is part of, in general though, what's going to fuel an incredible increase in the amount of higher education for people in the country. The number of college-educated Americans doubled between 1940 and 1960. And it was this group of largely white, but not exclusively, people who benefited from this increase that became the sort of workers that Mills describes in White Collar, which is a reference to the collar of a shirt, not a person in that case. Okay. On the other hand, working class, ethnically identified, largely Catholic families complicate the whole white flight paradigm, especially if they were older than draft age, so people over 30. If we look at Chicago over here, you can see what's missing in that map from 1950 that we looked at before, which is on the right, in comparison to what's called the community settlement map for 1950, which is on the left. So the map on the left, for it, what's really important is not simply race, and you still see those radiating lines according to race that are coming out from the downtown area outward, but also the extent to which what gets called a city of neighborhoods, but really this notion that it's also an ethnically segregated city in 1950 in ways that are clear enough that distinguishing between Poles and Italians and Ukrainians really makes sense and you can actually map it. So it's a very different sort of world. Now, these people who were ethnic, often Catholic, and often older white people settled in Chicago were more often pre-war home owners instead of renters. And therefore they were rooted to particular parishes with geographic boundaries and were more invested financially and culturally in preserving what they considered the racial integrity of their neighborhoods. Because their investment was so much greater, because they couldn't just decide not to be there because their money was all tied up in their home, they more often used violence or intimidation to preserve status quo delineations between white and black territory rather than simply flying away in white flight. Historians often cite Chicago as one of the key localities where ethnicity fragmented white responses to shifting boundaries for segregated neighborhoods. White women were often among the most adamant defenders of residential segregation. They often led daylight attacks and vandalism because the police were reluctant to arrest them. White men, in turn, often used the language of masculinity to explain why they opposed desegregation, arguing that they were simply protecting white women from black men. This claim, of course, rested on a fundamentally racist premise, one my class talked about earlier this semester when we were first exploring lynching, namely the idea that somehow black men's sexuality was uncontrolled and indiscriminate, all evidence aside. So when you have these kinds of suburbs developing, you're also, if you remember, I was referencing the fact that rationing meant that people way across the board in the United States had all essentially collected extra money that they were ready to spend. And African American entrepreneurs recognized an opportunity that the exclusion of African Americans from housing developments like the Levitowns on the right side of the screen created new opportunities for other forms of suburbs that could appeal to the black middle class. So if you look at the advertisement on the left, you can have a moment where you ask yourself, how do you know as a reader in the 1950s that this community would be safe for you and your African American family? Well, there's a reason why the owner is featured in it, right? Sid Wood says, don't miss out. Because having an African-American person in the advertisement was a way to really quickly signal that this is a place where African-Americans would be sold homes. Whereas other places, such as the Levittowns, were essentially protected by what were called housing covenants. In other words, rules that said that the owner of a house was only allowed to sell that house to other people who were white. This kind of covenant existed all over the country, and despite being declared illegal in 1948 by the Supreme Court, would still continue to be used in many places, not only against African Americans, but depending on the geographic location, against Native Americans or Jewish people, or just about anything else you can name. So African Americans who were members of the middle class and who had accumulated enough capital could somehow, they had a few different options. One was to buy in this kind of new housing development. Another was to purchase a home in some of the traditional African American suburbs that had existed from the 1910s onward. And sometimes after housing covenants had collapsed and their illegality was recognized, they could move into suburbs that did have, might have been founded for white people, but now that they were legally required to be open to others. So the departure of the Black middle class from a lot of the cities, however, meant that inner cities were increasingly Black and poor. This was really a dramatic departure from a previous history in which there had been a kind of vibrant inner class Black neighborhood that we talked about earlier. In my class, when we were talking about the Great Migration, we were talking a lot about the growth of Harlem and how it flourished in an era in which people who were of different classes and different occupations were of necessity living right adjacent to each other, and kind of the opportunities that fostered for artistic development with the Harlem Renaissance. So conditions in the cities, however, seemed to get worse and worse until the 1950s and 1960s, creating what some historians and theorists call the urban crisis. So that's another phrase, much like white flight or redlining, it's urban crisis. And the urban crisis was one of persistent, concentrated, and racialized poverty. Once magnets of opportunity, cities such as Detroit were sent in a downward spiral as the auto industry, Detroit's primary employer, moved its factories to suburbs that promised tax breaks. So let's look at Detroit a little bit more. As jobs left for nearby and mostly white cities such as Lansing and Flint, Detroit was in no position to offer similar tax breaks for one reason. It needed to improve its aging infrastructure. On top of that, it had an enormous school district and had to support a growing population of poor people. Because people left Detroit for the suburbs, because they moved out to those other areas, the people who remained were the people who weren't necessarily able to contribute as much to taxes. And so as a result, you have cities that are trying to do more and more with fewer and fewer tax revenues. Now, unions had few tools to protest the movement of jobs out to the suburbs and were largely distracted by the massive problem of automation. New machines and auto factories eliminated a lot of jobs, and at the same time, smaller employers who couldn't afford automation were going bankrupt and therefore couldn't offer jobs. So laid off workers were, of course, also consumers, and this too meant a decline in the need for consumer products. So once again, the economic problems that racked Detroit generally were experienced differently by white and Black employees. Black workers' lack of seniority and unions' demand that last hired, first fired meant that Black workers lost their jobs in greater quantities because they were among the more recent hires. Likewise, the decline of the auto industry meant the near elimination of kind of these entry-level jobs, which African American men had depended upon if they had just recently migrated from another area of the country. Finally, white workers had the option of moving out to the suburbs to follow the new plants, whereas Black workers could not because so many of the suburbs were racially restricted. So in the white popular imagination, the job turnover of African American men was perceived as evidence that they were essentially unemployable, but there's actually a lot of structural factors that better explain the problem of African American employment in cities, which did in fact become an issue. So one way to think about this is how this same story repeats again in Flint. Okay. So this is a story that is, especially in the last 10 years, but really since the 1990s, has been the story of Detroit kind of a second time. So Flint was one of the places that the auto industry had moved to in Michigan. And it had been a suburb, and it had been vibrant, and it had really been somewhere between a city and a suburb because of the amount of capital that had moved into the area. But there's massive plant closings due to automation and international relocations in the mid-1980s. Just as Flint had offered tax breaks and lured industry away from Detroit, so now other countries and other cities in other countries were offering better tax breaks than what Flint could provide. And as a result, those industries were now leaving Flint. So if you notice in the sign on the right, you have a reduction in GM's employees from 80,000 in 1978 to its current employment of 700. Very few cities can absorb that kind of job loss in a straightforward manner. The problem is, too, that one of the reasons, again, why Flint couldn't counter-offer things that would keep jobs in Flint is because its infrastructure, too, was starting to age. And this explains why we get the Flint water crisis. So with the Flint water crisis, we, again, have this massive problem where the infrastructure can't be improved because there's not the tax base to do it. And again, we're confronted with that story that what would be required in order to do it in terms of federal funds are not being provided. And so this is a consequence of what happens when the country doesn't think as a whole. So in the 1960s, we have this story that's a really intriguing but weird sort of story with housing and how housing and segregation are connected to each other. The suburbs are continuing to flourish, and they continue to be mostly white. This flourishing had many roots, including the ability of white veterans to get housing loans, but also technological innovations in house construction and innovations financed largely by government-funded research, as well as government-funded home loans. Yet history is complicated, and the suburbs represented a confluence of the American dream and true opportunities for socioeconomic mobility with mass ennui, emasculation, cultish domesticity, and materialism. Despite the appearance of the chef to the left, it's true that Americans were getting happier and healthier, but they weren't completely happy or healthy, and they were starting to have troubles in figuring out why. Some of this would have had gendered variances. Later in the semester, we'll look at Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, which investigated the idea of, her quote, a problem that has no name. What does it mean when one experiences no pain or need, but still isn't happy? How do you wind up like the white-collar man that Mills described, and what do you do about that kind of problem? So for my students, I'd like you to look at two post-lecture exercises, and I'd like you to use the resources that are under the Pages section of Canvas, and then contribute also to the discussion section there. So the first is the lyrics to and a recording of Pete Seeger's Little Boxes. This song is also recorded by a whole bunch of other people over time, and at one point it was the lead song for Weeds, if anybody saw that. Basically, the song itself, the Little Boxes, are very much inspired by suburban houses. In fact, houses that look like this. So these houses, these little boxes, are in Daly City, California, which Seeger saw as a main reference point. I want you to think about what these lyrics mean and what kind of normative judgment, what kind of judgy judgment, in other words, Seeger is making about suburban life and how that reflects or is in tension with some of the other descriptions that we've heard. I chose this in particular because for my students, we're going to talk about Pete Seeger again later. He's a folk singer, and folk singers have a lot to say. The other thing I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look at the racial segregation map. It's an interactive map sponsored by the University of Richmond and others that basically looks, it uses this unique dot system in order to understand how segregation works and how it's laid out now. What I'd like you to do on there is to look up several different places. I want you to look up where you're from, where your friends are from, and then look up some places that are close to your school. Look up New York. I had a student a few years ago who was from Birmingham, Alabama. That's a really interesting choice. Look at those based on contemporary census data and see how even on a block by block, segregation has proven really difficult to undo in residential housing, and start asking yourself some questions about why exactly that might be the case. Okay, so thanks for joining me for this lecture. The next one should be coming up pretty soon, but it'll probably be a few more days. Okay, thank you, and nice to meet you if you're one of Professor Scott's students.